In this video will be shown how to properly set up a MobiCall redundancy and synchronization. Requirements: here are 2 licensed MobiCall systems with the master and supervisor licenses. Also the synchronization license is needed. First, start up the NewVoice Setup Wizard and on the left side change to Main Alarm Settings. Here you can find several options. The first 2 checkboxes needs to be activated for the redundancy and the sync. Activate them and press on Apply at the bottom. Start with the setup of the redundancy. For this, change to the now popped up redundancy settings. Now start with the configuration. In the drop-down menu select your local IP interface. With the button redundant alarm range can be the alarms for the redundancy defined, can be useful on cluster solutions with about 1000 alarms per MobiCall server. Default: the alarms from 9000 are not redundant, since those are mostly hardware-related alarms. Define your alarm range and click the OK button or on Cancel if you did not do any changes. Next checkboxes are to deactivate the redundancy for defined alarms, like a conference alarm, what should be always handled by one server, since a conference can't be created over 2 MobiCalls. It is possible to deactivate alarms what are launched via incoming call, incoming conference and DECT localization. The next settings are to define which server is the master and which server is the supervisor. Also, it is possible to define for each alarm which server is master and which is supervisor. This can be used for load sharing or if the system is set up as cluster and every location got its own alarm range. If you don't use load sharing or building a cluster, define the master and the supervisor server. On defining the master, it is possible when clicking on the button Supervisor Alarms to define an alarm range which should also be launched on the supervisor if launched on the master. This can be used if the alarm is only received on the master, as example at a web launch. Activate the checkbox, define the IP of the supervisor and define the alarm range what should be also launched on the supervisor. When defining this server as supervisor, activate the box This MobiCall alarm server is supervisor and define the IP address of the master in the field below. When using load share or a cluster, activate the box This MobiCall can be master or supervisor depended on the configuration of the alarm with the box below. Activate alarm specific load share function. The load sharing can be activated. Once set up, click on the button Settings below to show the monitor between master and supervisor. Here should be now the local server. Only the second server, master or supervisor, needs to be configured now. For this, press the button Add New Server and fill in the computer name, the IP address. The port number is 4010 and can be changed here. Make sure that the MobiCall server can communicate via this port and at the end fill in the location where the second server is standing. Activate the checkbox Check Connection to Server to let the MobiCall servers pull each other to check for the connection. If the second server is not reachable anymore, MobiCall will launch an alarm. Click on OK and check if the server is shown in the window, and click on OK to confirm your settings. Click on the button Extended Settings to show all possible options for redundancy. Here can be defined more settings than in the normal setup wizard, like max. Retries to connect to master and wait before connecting to master. With the button Documentation, the documentation on how to set up the redundancy can be opened. Press the Apply button when configured the redundancy. Now the program NVHamaster.x has been added to the AutoStart and the NewVoice Line Monitor. To start, open up the NewVoice Line Monitor from the desktop and click on System and then on AutoStart. Here you can find the NVHamaster.x and the NVSync.x. Select the NVHamaster.x and start by clicking on Start at the right side. Let the NVSync.x stop since it is not set up properly. Now open up the Alarm Central and click in the top bar, above the data of persons and group on the redundancy monitor to see if the master and the supervisor are connected. When the NVHamaster.x is started on both systems and the watchdog connection is active, the remote server should be shown in green and on status should be shown that the connection is OK. If this is not the case, check if the watchdog is active and the data are correct and the NVHamaster.x is started properly on both systems. For further assistance, contact NewVoice support. Since the redundancy is set up now, A few more options in case of an alarm can be defined. For this, add a new alarm or edit an already existing one. In this alarm, the Settings tab redundancy has been added and can be defined. For this, enter the Settings tab. First checkbox is to activate redundancy for this alarm. If the alarm is in the global range, the checkbox is active and can be deactivated if needed for single alarms. Second checkbox to activate is to also launch this alarm on the supervisor when started on the master. Can be useful if alarms are launched via the web interface. If it is set up to configure for every alarm individually who is master and who is supervisor, can be defined here which server is the master and which server is the supervisor for alarms. With active load sharing can be defined here how many % of this alarm which MobiCall server should handle. For an active redundancy, the database needs to be replicated to the second server, that both MobiCall systems having the same database entries. For this, open up the NewVoice Setup wizard and on the left side click on SQL Database Settings. On the SQL Database Settings, activate the checkbox Replicate Data to another SQL database on redundant MobiCall server. With the first drop-down menu, define how many replications are in use. Can be useful for a cluster environment. With the drop-down menu below the button Extended Settings, can be defined what replication number should be given on this entry you are creating. If there is only master and supervisor and no more system, keep it default on 1. Enter the IP address of the remote server in the field below and click on Add Replication DSN and confirm your setting by clicking the Yes button. With a click on ODBC Administrator and on top on System DSN, you can see all entries. The ODBC entries with a number behind are the currently added entries for the replication. Click on OK and repeat on the other MobiCall server or servers. Now that the redundancy is set up, it is necessary to properly set up the synchronization that both MobiCall servers are having the same data of alarms, persons, interfaces, etc. Similar to the redundancy settings, the synchronization needs to be defined. Start in the first drop-down menu by selecting the IP address of this MobiCall server. Below needs to be defined which server is master and which is supervisor. Define properly on both servers and fill in the credentials from the supervisor when activating the checkbox. This is the primary MobiCall server, and fill in the IP address or server name of the master when activating the checkbox. This is a secondary MobiCall server. Click the Apply button and then click on the Settings button to show the extended settings for the synchronization. In the first field, the web path is shown. This is the path where the primary server saves all relevant data for the synchronization. Several options can be defined below, like the interval between synchronizations, 12 hours by default, the IP address or name of this server. Then by default it is set up that the primary server zips the files if they are larger than a defined amount, 1 GB by default. For this, the 7-zip must be installed on both servers. With the next 4 settings buttons can be defined which files should be synchronized. With the first settings button can be defined which INI files should be synchronized. Be careful that only the files what are equal on both servers are synchronized. If you are not sure what files you can sync and what should be changed by hand, contact NewVoice support. With the second settings button can be defined which files should be not synchronized. With the third settings button can be defined which additional files should be synchronized. With the third settings button can be defined to sync specific files on change. For a basic configured redundancy, keep the next checkbox Synchronize all system and queue databases active. If you are using different queue and channel settings, then deactivate this box. Fill in the computer name, IP address of the client, define the synchronization type. You can define between normal synchronization or client synchronization. On client synchronization can be defined which alarm range, which persons and groups should be synchronized. This is needed in a cluster environment. Fill out the needed fields and click on OK at the bottom. With the last checkboxes can be defined to start the sync after the alarm and group database has been generated after editing or adding persons and groups. Second box is to let the server synchronize the system time with the master. Third box is to let MobiCall generate a release list of all currently used programs and compares it with the second server. Now switch to the supervisor server. Similar to the redundancy settings, the synchronization needs to be defined. Start in the first drop-down menu by selecting the IP address of this MobiCall server. Below select this as a secondary MobiCall server and fill in the IP address of the primary server. Click again on the settings. Here can be defined in the HTTP path to get the data from the master. Depending on what you entered in the setup wizard, you will see the link here. With the button test can be tested if the secondary server is reaching the primary server. If you get an error, check if the data is correct and there is a connection between master and supervisor. Check if the web is running and if the nvsync.x is started. Contact NewVoice support for further assistance. With the field below can be program options defined for SSL connection. As example, with no check certificate can be set that the certificate will not be checked for validity. Below is the folder for the local download of the data from the primary server. Default is d:/nvt/download. Define the interval between the synchronizations for the same time frame, so both 2 hours or both 1 hour as example. By activating the checkbox "Only synchronize client-specific settings" is active that this server is only synchronizing what is defined to synchronize, must be set up on the master. With the drop-down menu below is defined which alarm is started in case of in-sync error, alarm 9866 by default. With the last two checkboxes is defined which program MobiCall should use to unzip the data received from the primary server, 7-zip by default and can be changed. Now click the OK button and click on OK in the setup wizard. Open up the NewVoice line monitor and click on System in the left top corner and then on Auto Start. Now select the nvsync.x and click on Start on the right side. Close the Auto Start settings by clicking the OK button. Open up the NewVoice Alarm Central and in the top bar above the persons and groups click on the synchronization monitor. You find it left beside the redundancy monitor. Now you see currently running synchronizations and older synchronizations. By pressing the button Synchronize Now to start a sync, this can be done on the primary or secondary server. With the button Compare Release, the release versions of the programs will be compared when activated earlier, and with Compare Any files the configuration files will be compared. Now the MobiCall redundancy and synchronization is set up properly and can be tested. Do this by making changes on the master and start a synchronization. When the changes also appears on the supervisor, the synchronization is working. Test the redundancy by turning off the master or the supervisor and launch an alarm to see if the second server is overtaking. Also launch one alarm when both servers are running, to see if the correct master processes the alarm properly.